1975, I decided to become a pilot. It was the start of some great adventures for me. Once I even got a little hands-on flying in one of Goodyear's blimps. It was, well, slow. But on the other side of that coin, I flew a Learjet once, briefly, at 41,000 feet and Mach 0.82, by hand, on a crystal clear night over Chicago. It was, well, fast and very sensitive to inputs. Such great memories. I've been alive for a good while now. My speech rate has slowed through the years, but I still have a few things to say before I move on. When I started my flight training, I was in charge of a young family, a young wife, 2 crawling kids, but I knew more money would come along. So I went to my local airport to inquire, and there it was, Bowl 6580 Golf, sitting idle on the ramp, patiently waiting to teach someone how to fly. Looking back now, it seems odd how a little training plane like that can beam so much promise. I was using the pay-as-you-go plan. I had only logged 6 hours when the hard reality of affording a family squashed my flight training allowance. I reached an impasse: provide for my family or continue my expensive flight lessons. The break in my training regimen eroded some inertia. When I continued instruction, I struggled a bit to get back up to speed. On a bitter cold day in late October, I went to the airport for another lesson. Winter arrived early in the northern state that day, and in haste I had thrown on a pair of light shoes. Our plan was to fly north along Lake Michigan's shoreline before turning inland to the practice area. The 150-seater was no match for the brutal cold wind. By the time we got to the practice area, my left foot had gone numb. I couldn't even feel the rudder pedals. I was frustrated. My determination waned. Nearly defeated, I said to my instructor, "Don, I think we should cancel training today and go back and land." He just nodded acknowledgement and started flying the trainer back to the airport, while I frantically worked my toes trying to restore circulation. After he landed, we turned off the runway and taxied for the warmth of the FBO lounge. Don appeared to be lost in thought. Then, Suddenly he proclaimed, with all the insistence he could muster, "Okay, you're going to fly your first solo. Today." I looked at him with dumbfounded shock for a second, then asked, "Do you really think that's a good idea?" "We'll wake your foot back up inside," he said. "Then I want you to come right back out to this plane and take it up in the pattern for 2 touch and goes, then a full stop landing." Don had perceived my frustration with catching up in my training. He was concerned I might break it off again. The thrill of soloing is a good cure for that. So after restoring the circulation of my foot, I did go right back out to that airplane and taxied it out for my solitary debut. I was nervous that my foot might go numb again while I was alone, but the solo went well. My feet stayed warm. I wondered if it was because they had some kind of awareness that they had to. After that flight, I felt invincible. "I can do this," ricocheted within the walls of my total being. I felt like I was on a fresh course then. Just a little further to go now. On February 20, 1977, I completed my required solo VFR cross-country trip, flying Holland to Traverse City to Flint Bishop Airport and back home. Between Traverse City and Flint, I was dodging snow showers, following my course changes closely on an old paper VFR chart. We didn't know the luxury of GPS navigation. The well-established network of VORs and non-directional beacons were the primary aids to navigation back then. I was used to being within sight of the Lake Michigan shoreline. It was far more difficult to stay on top of my location without that handy reference, while avoiding the dense snow showers scattered about the countryside of the inland. One day, shortly after 60 hours of training flights, Don and I were debriefing in the back office after a flight. When he set his calculator down, looked up at me and said, "Well, you've met all the requirements and then some. I do believe you're ready for your check ride." I felt more than ready and confident in my learned skills. I had been studying hard. Federal Aviation Regulations, the Airman's Information Manual, Flying Magazine, anything aviation related I could get my hands and eyes on. It was early spring in Michigan, when the weather is quick changing and unpredictable. For the next month, Don kept trying to schedule an examiner to come to Holland from Grand Rapids for my check ride. Four times these appointments had to be canceled due to unexpected bad weather. Another possible check ride day came up in early April. I felt certain another cancellation was coming. The forecast was no good for a VFR flight. High winds and low clouds were already in place, and severe thunderstorms by early afternoon were expected. Don called at about 10. He said, "Hustle out to the airport." The examiner agreed to drive over from Grand Rapids. We only have a small window, but the clouds are just high enough. We're going to try to get this done today. As I drove to the airport, the stiff winds battered my pickup truck. I tried to not think about how much they would knock around a 150 in flight. The flight examiner seemed rushed to get through the oral examination of the test. Don had advised me not to try to BS my way through an answer if I didn't know it. It's much better to demonstrate you know where to find the answer quickly in the Federal Aviation Regulations or the old Airman's Information Manual. The examiner said I had demonstrated the required knowledge orally, and we would move on to demonstrating practical ability in the aircraft. I peered through the window hoping to see evidence that the surface winds had calmed somewhat, but they only appeared worse. As I walked around the tiny airplane, talking my way through the pre-flight, the plane's control surfaces flapped in the gusty winds. While taxiing out to the runway, I was careful to hold the yoke for proper wind deflection. I had never flown in this much wind before. The anemometer in the office was indicating 200, variable 270, at 18 gusting to 30. I remember feeling relieved that runway 23 was favorably aligned for the shifty winds. The inspector told me to take off into the headwinds and head for the practice area. Once there, we did some turns at about a point, some S turns, pretty straightforward stuff. Except the wind at 2,500 feet was really cranking and still playing in the back of my mind, haunting projected thoughts of difficult landings. Then he asked me to execute a power-off stall. Gradually, I pulled the throttle back. My better sense seemed to be fighting that action. I was barely making headway across the ground even at full power. Just before the 150's airspeed bled back enough to induce the stall, I looked at the ground and was shocked to see I was being blown backwards. My ground speed had gone negative. It felt so unusual to be flying backward on a check ride, yet the aircraft was still flying. It was the first time I'd experienced that. I have to admit, it did shake me up some. How was I going to pull off acceptable landings for the examiner with these winds? I recovered from the stall and fought the wind to restore positive ground speed. He then told me to fly back to the airport for a full stop landing. That made me wonder if I had done something wrong and failed the exam. Uncertain, I started crabbing, and I mean really crabbing through the wind's loft toward the airport. When I turned final, the 150 was getting knocked around like a loose leaf in the wind. I had never had so much trouble staying established on the extended center line. Full yoke inputs became necessary to keep the wings horizontal and at proper pitch. My grip tightened as we approached the threshold. I felt the examiner looking over at me. He reached across the cramped cockpit and lightly tapped the back of my wet knuckles. "Relax your grip," he said. "We'll be all right. You're doing good." I followed Don's advice for high wind landings. No flaps, fly the airplane onto the runway. It won't settle on as normal. The 150 planted its gear firmly, as if relieved to be safely back on solid ground. "Okay, taxi into the ramp and shut it down," he said. He was silent as we taxied in. I had anticipated a longer flight, a closer examination of my ability and skill. When I reached the parking spot, I set the parking brake, pulled the mixture control, and confirmed all electric switches off. The examiner wasn't paying much attention to my aircraft handling at this point. He was busy writing some detailed notes. Probably my mistakes, I thought. The engine's work was done, except for the crackles of a cooling manifold that went silent. He reached across the cockpit with a handshake gesture and said, "Congratulations, you're a licensed pilot now. If you can handle a small plane so well in these winds, I'm convinced you're ready for the responsibilities that come with it." And he put his signature in my logbook right then and there, before we untangled our legs from the cramped aircraft. We walked into the FBO where I heartily accepted the congratulations of the flying friends I had made before heading home. I could hardly wait to tell my family I had accomplished my goal.